Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second edition of the CityLabs Dialogue series. And my name is Pratyush Shankar, and myself, along with my colleagues here at CityLabs, that's Snigdha, Vaibhavi, Amrita, Dhruv, and Kushi, uh, welcome you all to the second dialogue series, which we are going to have with Priyanka Sheth. Now, this is personally a very heartening moment for me that I'm interviewing Priyanka Sheth, who is also my student at CEPT. And there could be nothing more satisfying to see your own students do really, really well. Before I introduce Priyanka Sheth, I would like to just take a moment to introduce what we're doing in CityLabs. CityLabs, as many of you might already know, and you can look up our website, is an initiative where we are trying to raise more awareness about Indian cities. We're trying to create more research material available on Indian cities. And in some sense, ultimately what we're trying to do is to create a fraternity of like-minded scholars who are interested in understanding the cities better. And we feel that not many times we talk about the future, we talk about what should be happening to cities is very much dependent on how we understand them historically or even what is happening right now. So CityLabs keeps doing these seminars, workshops, and now it is also coming out with a publication which is titled Young Scholar Series. The dialogue series, as part of the CityLabs initiative, is a very, very interesting idea, because what it does is it invites people from the field of urban design, urban planning, but it also invites people from different allied fields. For example, in the last series, the first dialogue series, dialogue edition, we had Professor Prof come and talk about cities coming from a social and a political perspective. And today we have with us Priyanka Sheth, who has a wide range of experience in architecture, on questions of water, on questions of history, cities, urbanity. So she comes with a much more wider kind of a perspective. And we're trying to, get into a dialogue with her. So Priyanka, as I said, welcome to the CityLabs Dialogue series. I'm really, really happy to have you here. And just a small bit of introduction to Priyanka. So as I said, at a personal level, I can say that I've worked with Priyanka for quite some time. She was a student at CEPT University, also guided her thesis, worked on courses together on urban history, and also worked on book projects together. And I found her to be so focused, so extremely committed and sincere, and with a maturity which was always far beyond, her age. So Priyanka Sheth is an architectural designer, currently working at Bayer, Blinder, Belle Architects and Planners in New York, and focuses on preservation projects for academic and cultural institutions. Priyanka has a special interest in research related to preservation, traditional water infrastructure, and the evolution of urban form in Indian cities. That is also our common interest. Prior to coming to the US, she practiced as an architect in India and has taught design studios and urban history seminar courses focusing on Indian cities at CEPT University. She is one of the lead researchers for Stepwells of Ahmedabad, an ongoing collaborative research project focused on historic subterranean water structures called Stepwells, and a co-curator of related exhibitions in Ahmedabad, as well as at the Yale Architecture Gallery and the Cooper Union. She's also a co-author of the book Stepwells of Ahmedabad. And really, Priyanka, congratulations on this wonderful publication.
Thank you.
Super excited to see it in much more detail. So She's recently authored this book, co-authored. She's a lead author for this book, Stepwells of Ahmedabad, Water, Gender, Heritage, which was published by Kalmo Edition in Madrid. She has Masters of Architecture from Yale University and a Bachelor of Architecture from CEPT University. Welcome, Priyanka.
Thank you so much.
Dialogue series.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me as part of this dialogue series. I was so excited, and to be honest, I felt so honored that you thought of me to be a part of this. So thank you for that.
Great. Yeah, I mean, as I was making a remark that we're trying to get into the question of cities, but we're not trying to approach the question directly. And we're trying to understand city from a variety of perspectives. Today, we will try to perhaps make sense of it from the perspective of your own research. But one of the other objectives of our dialogue series is to also understand a person. Yep. And that's for us is in some sense very, very important, especially for young scholars. So some of the questions that I'll be asking you would also be about your journey. Yep. As a researcher. But let's begin with your latest work. And first of all, congratulations for your work on Stepwells of Ahmedabad. And I'm really curious because I've been following this work for quite some time. I've seen it personally at different stages and with different sessions. Sometimes it were part of an exhibition, sometimes part of a talk. Tell us more about it. Tell us about the journey that you guys took to finally. I know you call it ongoing, and it is ongoing.
It is ongoing, yes.
We have reached a kind of a stage, a particular kind of a stage where you have come up with a publication. Tell us more about this.
Yes. So this whole journey goes back to 2015, as a matter of fact, when I had just finished my thesis, which actually, Pratyush, you had guided. And at that point of time, I was approached by Riaz Tayyabji, a former professor, and of course, a colleague of yours at CEPT, where we didn't quite have really an agenda of what to do, but we started looking at this one step well by Hariniva, which is fairly famous. We all know about it. Students have been going there over time. I was familiar with it. So I started going to this one step well every day, and then really started talking to the people around the stepwell. And again, it was kind of in an attempt to understand the urbanity around that particular stepwell. And I would start talking to people, the caretaker, there was a chai galla, then I would start talking to the people there. And then I remember there was behind the stepwell, there are all these, it's like, it was a very industrial area as well. So then in the process, they said, oh, if you are interested in stepwells, there's another one. Why don't you go there? And then I went there, and it was Mata Bhavani Niva, which is again fairly famous. But at that point of time, I didn't know about it. And it was really this kind of, going on the ground, talking to people, and they would point out that if you're interested in a well, stepwell, why don't you go to that one? And usually they would point out to a temple. So the stepwell had actually been converted into a temple. And you talk to the pujari and they would point out. So what happened is in the process, we realized that there is more than those 2 or 3 stepwells that we all know as architects or students of architecture. And for that matter, even the kind of stepwells that get interest as far as preservation goes from the state agencies or agencies related to heritage conservation and so on. And it was pretty astounding to us that it was an ecosystem, perhaps back in the day, where you had so many of these stepwells, almost like all these straws that are going into the aquifer, almost like. But that was the city, and so that is something that intrigued us, and we decided we have to start drawing these. And again, it was myself and a cohort of friends from CEPT, Tanvi Jain, my sister Ashini, who was still in her second year at that time. And we started drawing these. We had Malay Doshi and Karan Gajjar, who were fantastic photographers. So it was again like a group think that let's draw this, and it was really driven by enthusiasm. And that was kind of the intent behind the first few exhibitions in Ahmedabad. Just presenting our documentation, it was work in progress, it was not perfect, but to share it with the city, it was in the public exhibition nature of it back then in 2016. And then in the meanwhile, I started grad school here at Yale, and they had a call for student exhibitions, and I just submitted this as a proposal. And that kind of was like the next step. It kind of propelled us to look at some of the more historical, theoretical, kind of aspects and histories of these stepwells. So in many ways, it started with fieldwork first, and then we started actually reading, referring to literary sources and so on more, rather than the other way around, where you start with the historical background. And we continued reading actually a lot, and it's kind of our interests are going beyond just the stepwells themselves, but really understanding water history of the city of Ahmedabad. And at the same time, we are also beginning to kind of critique present day practices, looking at present day attitudes to water, kind of understanding for ourselves how there is a shift in attitude during the colonial era, when there was a sealing of wells and even a lot of underground cisterns, to the privileging of centralized pipe water supply. And then, how in today's times, for example, water is used through a project like the riverfront. So the shifting attitudes to water from the pre-colonial times to colonial era practices, and now in the post-colonial era, where water is used in a certain way to project an image and so on. So it's kind of expanded beyond the initial documentation, and that's where we are. And that's the ongoing part of our project.
Thank you. No, I think it's wonderful. And I was just noting some of the points that you were saying. This whole thing about field work. And in some sense, it resonates a lot with what we were discussing with Professor Christoph.
Yes.
And I was talking about, because I keep meeting his students in India, and I met a lot of his students who do extensive field work. And I think the point that you're talking about field work is very valuable.
Mm-hmm.
That you don't start with a meta narrative sometimes, and sometimes you do. You
Yes.
actually, and a lot of this is very useful for young scholars. Many times you start, you get your hand dirty with something, and then you slowly expand. I think that's something a very interesting point about the value of simple field work that can take you places. I mean, literally and metaphorically, but it can open many other conceptual doors.
Yes.
And let me extend those. Let me open those doors here in our conversation. And I think I really like your analogy of straws going into the aquifers. We're almost imagining there is this larger imagination of a city with these, straws that are accessing. Would you like to explain that whole idea? Because it's a very fascinating urban imagination that you have here.
I will add to that. One is straws going into the ground, and the other analogy that my colleagues and I have recently been talking about is also a relationship with trade. A lot of these stepwells were strategically situated on trade routes, and the fact that Ahmedabad was an important mercantile center with connections to the Gulf of Khambat, but also northwest to Delhi and so on, and how these stepwells were situated on trade routes. So one is the straws that go into the aquifer, and the other is almost like service stations on a highway. It's like literally, once my colleagues and I were joking, they were almost like petrol pumps, like in the sense that there's so many. And I think that's the part that we are still always fascinated by, is that there were just so many. And this is not just true for Ahmedabad, but if you start looking at settlement patterns in a lot of parts of Western, semi-arid regions, of Western India, and even some parts of Central India, as a matter of fact. But the Western India part is interesting because of the trade relation. And so they were like service stations where you go, you recharge, you nap, you know how we like stop at a petrol pump, you go to that little store. And that kind of an imagination of kind of So that is another way of imagining this, and that's what happens on the surface, like just the ubi, the sheer number of step wells that existed and how commonplace they were in many ways. So one is the straws that go into the aquifer,
Yeah.
and then the service station. So I think both those analogies are very fascinating. Coming back to the aquifer again, and the groundwater aspect is something we are very, very interested in, and there's still a lot of work and understanding that we have to do as we go ahead. But keeping in mind that, in this part of India, most parts of India, but this part of India, the reliance on groundwater is so much more than some parts of, let's say, the Gangetic Plain or in Bengal or even in southern India for that matter. And the aquifer is this invisible source of life in this region. And talking about straws, when you start replacing these wells, which had a natural replenishing cycle, the monsoon comes, we are joining Talaudi or the reservoir, which is what we found very often next to a step well, there was a Talaudi, and percolation takes place. It's like a large collection catchment area. And then you kind of extract water through the well, which has filtered through the layers of the earth. It's cleaner and so on. So those associations were very much there. But there was a rate of replenishment as far as the monsoon goes. There were annual cycles. You are not pumping out water the way mechanized systems were doing. And with the coming in of tube wells and bore wells, you still have those straws, more invisible, more inconspicuous, more streamlined, and too many of them, too many straws in the same Coke bottle. Again, that's another, and then what happens? So in a way, the changing of the well technology over time has led to aquifer depletions, and that's again a bigger ecological problem. So this whole tapping into the ground and the expression of how you tap into the ground, and then the mechanism of how that expression actually works is also something we are very interested in studying, and the fundamental shift in attitudes to water.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting points that you're raising. And I quite like your imagination of these petrol stations in a larger geography. This is almost like a different way of looking at a larger regional spatial construct. And this is something that goes beyond cities,
Yes.
almost like a network that encapsulates settlements, cities, villages, etc. My second question is related to your whole observation about the visible and the invisible. Recently, myself and Professor Annette Rudolph at TU Darmstadt, we did this research together, looking at different traditional water systems and also looking at Pune as one of the examples. And one of the things that we all agreed on is how the fact that, yes, these are invisible aquifers, but for example, in the case of Ahmedabad and semi-arid areas, the presence of water is made visible at certain moments. That's what step well does. That's what a tank does. That's what these water structures do. Even in Kathmandu Valley, there are these subterranean water structures, and the Dhungadaras, the point where there are spouts, water spouts, is when water is made visible, and in the process, the community is made aware of the presence of water. So there is a constant awareness of the fact that water is flowing below us. Yeah. And of course, in case of Kathmandu Valley, it was linked with an urban design attitude, city squares, and etc. etc.
Yes.
One of the things that the modern water supply does is it hides everything. We really don't know where the water comes from. We really don't know where it is going. We don't know how much it gets wasted. So I'm just trying to provoke you for a kind of maybe I'm getting more into the ideas of solutions. One that we have been discussing is perhaps combination of traditional and modern water structures. A hybrid solution might be a way out. But what are your views on this question of the visible and the invisible? Not only historical perspective, but also from a perspective that can give us some hope of what can happen, you know?
This is again something we have been talking about. And again, I would like to reiterate that my colleagues and I, especially Ashini and Tanvi, we have been thinking about this so much. What next? And in fact, Tanvi is kind of pursuing some of these questions through her research thesis at the University of Cambridge. I think when it comes to resources like water and the fact that, you know, these structures reveal the water, like the historic structures, and it's not just a revelation of water, it's the way in which they reveal the water. It's all the ornamentation for some of these step wells, the beauty, the celebration of water. There's also the whole notion of the sacrality of water, and it is even more sacred and prized in a semi-arid geography where water is such a valuable resource. So it's not just the revelation of water, which I would like to kind of emphasize upon, but it's also the way in which water is revealed. And there's so many lessons for us as architects, just in terms of the architectonics of the revelation of water, which is, to me, till date, it's one of the most beautiful and fabulous architectural expressions ever in my whatever I'm exposed to as far as architecture is concerned. So that is another thing. It speaks about a certain collective reverence as a society, as a culture, for the way in which you reveal water. And then also it has its practical purposes, like you see, oh, the water level is low. You better not, you know, you better use it carefully, because you can see how low it's gone, or you can see how high it is up there. And the beauty of these structures is that you can see these markings of water, like when they were up and down, and there's a whole lot of folklore and poetry actually associated with the shifting water levels in these structures that we were actually looking at as well, where, and again, I'm going to say that women were the ones who typically performed the labor of going to the well, fetching water. It was a very gendered, it's gendered labor, historically and in many parts of India even today. So there is this association with the shifting water levels, the anxiety that you see, that is kind of brought out in these songs when, oh my, the water has gone down so much and I have to work extra hard to get the water out. So there is also this whole cultural folklore, the anxiety of a woman, how many steps she has to walk down and how much she has to go up, versus imagine when the water is up high. So there's this whole other dimension to visibility, you know, in terms of expression, in terms of just the daily labor associated with fetching water. And then what has happened with piped water supply, where you have this one tube, which is actually a well that goes down, and it's a shifting notion, a shifting attitude. And I think all of us as inhabitants of, you know, cities with piped water supply, we fail to sometimes realize that it's a finite source, and a lot of the current water paradigms are actually based on this premise of water being an infinite source. I mean, take the riverfront, for example. Water is visible, but it's the shifting attitude to water, where you think it's okay to bring water from a perennial river a few miles away just for political or social or political or aesthetic imagery in a certain way. So then the visibility of water is also fraught in a case like the riverfront. And perhaps that shift in attitude comes from the transition from these wells and step wells and the visibility of water to these invisible pipes that go in, and you lose a certain direct relationship. A lot of the community structures around the maintenance of these wells were basically, you know, abandoned in the process. The whole social relationships and internal networks of women that, oh, you all gather, you go to the well together. That's your time with your friends, you know, and those things have in many ways perhaps disappeared as well. That is not to say that you expect women to go and fetch water like that. You know, I think we also need to be very mindful of contemporary questions of labor, gendered labor, and but at the same time, is there a third way where we can privilege a certain reverence, a certain attitude to water, at the same time abandoning former structures of social exclusion, which were often associated with wells? Who gets to go to the well? The caste hierarchies. Uh, Very often, the people who built the well diggers, were probably not allowed to go to the very well they built because of caste hierarchy. So when we talk about a traditional approach combined with a modern approach, where you revive some of these structures for just for visibility as a social attitudinal change, but at the same time you're mindfully aware of not replicating some of the problematic social structures that existed around these as well.
That's very well said. I think I'm really glad you brought this thing out, because I think very important to remember the kind of, or very important to critically examine history.
Mm-hmm.
And one cannot romanticize anything without critiquing something that we would not agree to in today's day and age. And I think it's very important that you guys are, whereas trying to establish the importance of these structures, but at the same time being critical of
Mm-hmm.
kind of practices that were operating around the production of this. So I think what one would need now is almost a reinvention, a reimagination, or a
Right.
juxtaposition. And I think I'm glad that you're asking this question. So my next question, in some sense, you partly answered, but it will be worthwhile to elaborate on that more. See, this whole interest in historic structures is something that we have noticed in the academia within India, especially right from 1970s. Yeah, it really picks up in the 80s and 90s. And if we do notice, a lot of the early works of historical documentation were essentially, the mandate was to first document, because they were hardly understood. The mandate was to, also it was in some sense a critique of the high modern, where you were saying, hey, where is India here? And it's a discovery of India in some sense. So obviously it is tinged with a level of romance. It is tinged with a level of, saying that this is what we are. But a lot of water has passed since. It's been almost 40 years now since we have had a huge tradition of historic documentation. How do you see your work today in 2020? Different. And I think you're partly already getting there when you talk about questioning the earlier models. But how do you think, if you can put it in clearer words, how do you think this interest in history is different and similar to what we have seen as some simpler direct documentation in the 70s, 80s, and in the earlier era? I think that would be very, very useful. And this answer would be very useful for young researchers, because they tend to sometimes, just reinvent the wheel.
Yes. I think, just kind of coming back to our process in some ways, it did start off as in the tradition of that simple, you just document it for what it is, draw it up, the precision of drawing and so on. But in many ways, I think when it comes to documentation, one other important tool is representation, and who is drawing it. I mean, this tradition of drawing historic structures, there's a coloniality embedded in it, where you had the Archaeological Survey of India, and they had drawn some of these stepwells as well. And we came across some of those drawings, and then we looked at our initial drawings, measure drawn, perfect. And I'm like, how are these different from what the colonists had drawn? And so I think we also have to bring in a certain subjectivity, being very mindful of the fact that we are South Asians from the place, we speak the language, we have the ability to do field work, and representing our history through those drawings. So I think an element of subjectivity is something perhaps some of these documentation exercises can actually look at. What do I mean by subjectivity? That's a big question. Whose subjectivity is it? Is it mine as a student who is positioned perhaps in a certain class of Indian society? Or is it the subjectivity of the people that are living around them? And there is a class, very often a caste angle to pretty much everything in our country, in our context. And I think kind of getting at those subjectivities is perhaps, and how do you represent that subjectivity in your drawing is also perhaps the way forward when we think of documentation. Subjectivity as authors who are drawing the subjectivity of what you are representing. Um, is it a matter of the way you draw life in your drawings, which actually we are very well trained at SEP, and I think in that way a certain departure from that whole French tradition where they used to go to Rome and you have all those drawings of Roman monuments and so on. And this came up in one of our conversations actually, how this documentation departs. Are you sometimes just documenting things for what they are? Like how important is precision of the object, the architectural object itself, and how much and where do you abandon the obsession with precision, but telling the story? So embedding storytelling within your documentation. And I think those are the interesting ways in which we can look at this process, also critiquing existing practices, which is just neutral, drawing it for what it is. And again, that's a tradition which is in many ways derived from the Western documentation tradition, but then kind of bringing in subjectivity within your documentation process. And it's a struggle we are still trying through representation. Is it drawing? Is it sometimes drawings are not enough? Is it filmmaking? Is it, media is just so diverse right now. Is it through conversations? Is it photo montages? What is it? And I think the question of subjectivity embedded in documentation is something I am very interested in.
Yeah, I think it's very well said. And also, I think, as you say, it's a struggle. It's not easy. And I think this is a question that I keep asking in my own work. And I think it is also our responsibility as scholars looking at history to how do we look at history and how do we look at history today is a very pertinent question, and I think we have to keep asking that question, because if we do not ask that question, then we get into a habit of representation. I'm very glad you spoke about how you are addressing this question from the manner in which you theorize your own representation, and representation is an ideological device. It is not value neutral, and I think I really am very glad you made that distinction between kind of representation that you are trying to do. But let me just take you slightly far away from this work, which you are absolutely embedded in right now, and I want to know more about your personal journey as a scholar, as a student, also from the perspective of that, and you were at, we say that's the best school in India, best school in one of the best schools in the world, and then you go on to study in Yale. Yeah, I think you've seen two very good institutions. Tell us about your experience in these two institutions in terms of whichever way you want to, similarities, dissimilarities, cultural differences. I would love to hear how you went about it.
Yes, I think that's a very important question. Questions of institutions in general, even more so considering the political environments that we are operating in, and in India and in the United States for a while. When I arrived, it was a very peculiar political environment where, I be very honest, I constantly felt, at least by the messaging that I was getting from the larger systems, that I'm not welcome here. And I think that is something has had a very deep impact on me, which I will talk about as well. But at the same time, I'm going to kind of go back to my SEP days, and there was a certain naive optimism, a certain kind of almost, a naive idealism that kind of was underlying through my entire time at CEP. And the institution was, of course, different. I felt, for whatever it was worth, whether it was real or not, but there was this sense of autonomy that as a student, I had felt at CEP back then, which was very valuable. Whether it was real or not, now that I think back, how much autonomy did I really have? I don't know. But at the same time, that belief that I had autonomy is something that kind of shapes you in a way where you are comfortable speaking out. A certain criticality comes in and you are comfortable expressing that criticality. And also just a value for certain grassroots level initiative, the culture of just doing. You want to do something, you do it. And in many ways, our work started in that spirit. I'm going to, oh, we like these steppers, let's just draw them. Kuch karte hai, that kind of an attitude. So that was my, I think at the back of my mind, it was this kind, I couldn't articulate it back then, but that spirit was always there. When I applied for grad school, there were things I was aware of, but things that I was not aware of. Institutions, especially like Yale, are embedded in a deep history of inequity. Talk about CEP. There's this 1960s post-independent new nation. That's the history of CEP as an institution when it began. There's an optimism. There's frugality, but you want to do things, and there is that hunger. Whereas Yale, talk about Yale as an institution. It got its money back in the day from its namesake, Mr. Elihu Yale, who was a slave trader. And he actually was working for the East India Company at Fort St. George in Madras. And the East India Company actually had a problem with him because he was just, so they fired him at some point. But he basically amassed his wealth through slave trade. And that's the namesake. And there's actually this book that I'm reading called Ebony and Ivy, Race and the Fraught Nature of America's Universities. And a lot of these older institutions in the United States, which are older than the United States itself, have a very dark history as far as where they got their funding from, and how a lot of these structures are still baked into these systems. And I think that awareness had a very different impact on my mind as a student at Yale, knowing that I come from a certain place, of the fact that people like me were not necessarily accepted not very long ago in these institutions. And I think that awareness kind of combined with the larger political rhetoric that was bombarded had a certain impact as far as my, mindset as a student was concerned. So there was a certain criticality embedded in my mind the moment I started school here, which was very different from the naive optimism that I had at CEP. That said, talking about architecture, we didn't do as much fieldwork the way we do at CEP, but I think there is a certain emphasis on textual sources, reading, theorizing, empiricism, like just the amount that I read in 2 years. And I didn't probably read as much in my undergrad education. You had a certain, you read these things, you have a reading response due every week. And not only that, everybody uploads their reading responses online, and you're supposed to critique everybody's reading responses, and you come to class after having performed that process. So the way in which I learned how to read, I think those were some very valuable takeaways from my education at Yale. And of course, there was, the travel, and these schools send you everywhere. Pre-COVID days, I went to Peru, and I went to Cuba, and I went to Finland, and again, I'm critical. As much as I love that, I'm also critical, like, oh, you are in this elite institution which has the money and is sending students from the United States to go and study for like 10 days. You go to Cuba, versus the culture of like the RSPs that I come from. So there was always this you go there, you get your hands dirty, you draw, you really like spend time there. And it's not this, you fly out from this fancy school. So I was always like critical of everything, even at my time at Yale. But that said, I cannot I cannot, discount what I got out of the process in terms of exposure and everything. And the logic of capital, education, that where you pay so much for an education. That's another important aspect as well when it came to my student experience at Yale.
Thank you. Thanks, Priyanka, for this very honest, very critical, and a very useful, sharing of experience, because I think it really helps. It really helps everyone, because I believe institutions play a huge role.
They do.
And I mean, you would agree too. We have all been shaped by the institutes we have been associated with. I mean, you have been associated with except for, let's say, 6 years or so. I was associated with it for almost 20 years. So institutions play a huge role. And I think it's very interesting how we move from one institution to another. We actually realize what our past institution was much better. I think I'm perhaps going through a same stage where now I am detached from CEPT and I'm at Navrachana University. And that distance is also allowing me to understand my past institution better.
Right.
That's very well said. I'll come to the last question.
I just want to say something, before we move on about institutions. The other thing that I want to talk about is also in schools like Yale, where they're trying to explicitly state that we have a problematic history in this country, and how institutions are trying to grapple with their inequities, with issues of representation, with issues of race. And in that sense, I think that willingness to engage, I think it's still in the beginning stages, but I think it's a very interesting time to be kind of privy to that conversation that is happening in institutions like Yale, but many others, where they are really trying to grapple with their past. And that conversation is something which is very, very important, which I don't know if it is happening. Maybe I'm not aware, I've been out for a while, but I think, is there a way in which we can find this critical conversation at an institutional scale in our institutions in India, and questioning our own legacies of exclusion? But then there's also this, but as a country we were colonized, so it's like this, it's a very peculiar moment in that. But I think there is a lot of scope, and I feel that schools here that are doing it, I feel there's a lot we can learn from that as far as looking at inequity is concerned.
Absolutely. I think not only inequities or legacies of institution is a debate that doesn't happen in institutions here.
Yeah.
But I would say inequities are, or the dark periods of Indian history is not even discussed at large. I mean, I think I remember those conversations, and I keep saying that I don't think we have even discussed the partition.
No, we haven't.
And one of the reasons I feel why there is so much tension between two neighbors is because we have never accepted that something horribly wrong happened during the partition from all sides. And I think, and I feel that the only hope towards a more peaceful and a society that accepts differences and accepts diversity, that process can only happen when we are willing to openly debate what we did not do right in the past. And in some sense, whereas I do see the experiences, especially in the recent times, the word peculiar is the only word that can explain that period of American history, recent political history. At least there is an effort to engage with uncomfortable questions. And I think institutes have to be able to do that. And
Yes.
Private institutes or public institutes should be engaging or should be examining themselves as to what they have been doing and what kind of biases sometimes have perpetuated, even within the institutes. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Interesting. I think this whole question of institute and ideologies is a very, very interesting question. I think maybe we should have perhaps another interview just on.
I could go on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, it's a very interesting topic. That's something very close to my heart also, because I feel they really impact lives, of everyone involved. Remember, I ran this whole series, The City and its University.
Yes.
All 2-3 scholars to speak, and I think another topic we can all pick up together as a conversation.
Yes.
Priyanka, coming to my last question, I think it's very rare to find people collaborating so well in different parts of. It's very common to find people who start something together, like you all guys, you, Malay, Tanvi, and the gang. Going to the city and documenting in your naive phase, as you called it. But it's not very easy to kind of take it through for years. I think what you guys have really achieved is how you have managed to not only stay in touch, but really productively collaborate and come up with very, very strong outcomes. And then you also working, it's looking at here, I don't know how somebody can even work because they're always fighting. How did you manage that? How did you pull it off? I know you and Tanvi were together in the KVDF forum, if I remember right.
It was.
But how did you manage to stick together, and how do you work together?
I think in many ways this work has grown so sporadically. There are moments of quiet, there was a lull, and then it suddenly picks up because an opportunity came by, and then everybody starts kind of banding back together, and we go back to our naive days when that enthusiasm, I think, in all of us is still that naive enthusiasm, which is so valuable, irrespective of what phase of life or our careers we are in. A lot of the newer stuff, which actually is fueled by the pandemic, we are sitting at home. In many ways, distances are collapsed now. You could be in Vadodara and Ahmedabad, but it's the same distance in many ways between the distance between me here in New York and my sister in Ahmedabad or Tanvi in Cambridge. But I think that the pandemic, and it really fueled a lot of momentum as well. It's a lot of phone calls and sessions like this for hours that just go on and on and on, and the time differences, and sometimes somebody has this epiphany in the middle of the night and you call up the other person, and it could be 3 a.m. at the other end, but you still wake up because it's your team member calling. And again, it's that enthusiasm that is so valuable, and we are so fortunate. And it's also something that was kind of inculcated in all of us as a culture, which we learned from CEPT as an institution, again, going back to the institution in some way. But the fact that something like that was valuable is something we learned collectively as young students back at CEPT, and it still fuels us. The other thing is that, for example, Tanvi is pursuing this in a different way through her research at Cambridge for her master's program. My sister, she has been looking at it in different cities in her thesis and so on. So there's a lot of pooling in of different resources. When I was at Yale, I had access to some other literature, or I learned so much about historic water systems in Peru because I was doing a studio in Peru. So it's like all this knowledge that we are getting from different places because we are so spread apart, and then we kind of come back together and then relook at our research. That has also led to a lot of intellectual momentum and how we are re-looking at our work over the years. And I think nobody fights. We don't fight. Everybody's just so excited just to do this that there's no room for fighting. It's a waste of time. So
nice. I think very well said. I'm just wondering because it seems that the fact that you were in 3 different locations, also having access to different intellectual traditions,
yes,
perhaps also explains why you could pull it off together. Because you are in the same environment, in the same institute, you tend to also think alike, have the same sources of inspiration, same sources of referencing. For example, you were referring to a whole different global perspective on questions of water, or Tanvi accessing a whole different tradition out there. And of course, Ashni figuring out her own thesis and her own fieldwork could have added a very different dimension to the whole work. That's rather interesting, and I think it also gives a lot of hope to a lot of young scholars to collaborate more, because so much is possible when we begin to work together. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, so I think I'm a big champion of collaboration and kind of not abandoning completely, but kind of moving away from this whole culture and architecture of singular authorship and the sole genius and that whole culture which is kind of intrinsic to the culture of architecture, even more so, I would say, in the West, and that's also being questioned quite a bit actually in schools. But in that sense, we are also very conscious now of positioning ourselves as scholars, as individuals who are from South Asia, but are now kind of in different universities in the West, but we are, we are from South Asia. We speak the language. And the other thing is, I think we should be, which is why I'm so happy that you have this initiative, is really developing a knowledge base of South Asia. It's so important that brings in that element of subjectivity, which when you have South Asian scholars talking about South Asia. So we also position ourselves in that larger, the way things operate as well.
Yeah, I think it's some very interesting insights, and I really like your like the way you are questioning this whole idea of the genius architect, the singular author genius architect, because I think increasingly, as I go along in my journey, I feel that if questions of cities, questions of societies have to be addressed, I think with this conference that Charles Correa was instrumental in curating, where I participated. This was when you were just about to leave for Yale. This was in him, and he had called, great cities, terrible places.
Yes, I remember this.
And I remember Correa always talking about how the idea of buildings, or within the Indian context, architecture is improving. You find much more beautiful buildings. But the cities are actually almost collapsing. So the private space is blooming, whereas the idea of the public is almost down in the drain. So in some sense, what I believe, this whole idea of collaboration, working together, engaging in conversation, exactly what we're trying to do here, is so very important. And I feel, I'm very confident that with such good bunch of people around at CityLabs, we are trying our level best to have more such conversations, create more material, and create material that is pertinent to South Asia, and not something where you have a kind of a Western gaze of the way we live, and I think it is a struggle, but it's really wonderful. It's very, very exciting. So,
yes, for sure.
With this, Priyanka, I would really want to thank you for finding time for this. Again, I wish to congratulate you on behalf of I think everyone here at CityLabs for the wonderful work, very inspiring work that you're doing. And
Thank you.
it's not only the beauty of the drawings, but I think the larger message of drawings that is very important for me, and the politics of representation and the larger examination of history that you're doing in the process, that is extremely, extremely valuable. Thanks for opening out today. Also
Thank you.
about your journey. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm so happy I could share all this with you through this platform, and it's not very often that I get to share so much, but also being so critical and knowing that there's going to be a healthy exchange of dialogue, and it's through platforms like this that we can continue doing what we do despite all the challenges of the larger world. Simply put.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot,
Thank you.
Priyanka, for this.
Yeah.